Good afternoon, gay friends. I'm Jennifer Bendery. I'm a senior politics reporter at the Huffington Post. And thank you. And I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll talk about some gay stuff. Next to me is Michael Connolly. He is a member of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta in Canada. Next to him is Mary González. She is a member of the Texas House of Representatives. Next to her is Park Cannon. She's a member of the Georgia House of Representatives. Next to her is Daniel Hernandez. He's a member of the Arizona House of Representatives. And on the end, we have Carlos Guillermo Smith of the Florida House of Representatives. So now I'm going to have each one of them take a minute to just say a little bit about what they do and what's going on in their houses. Go ahead, Michael.
Sure. Yeah, I was elected. I guess we'll start with being how millennial we are. I was elected when I was 21, so I'm 24 now. The way I was elected was very serendipitous, which is probably going to be the most hated person on this panel. What happened in Alberta, I'm from the NDP, which is the New Democratic Party. We're a social democrat party. Before the election in 2015, we held 4 out of the 87 seats. And then that election, we won 54 out of the 87, and we were planning to win about 10. So it was very odd, and how I basically got elected was they asked me in January, and I was still in school. I was at the University of Ottawa, so a couple provinces away, and I didn't think I was going to be back in time. But then in March, I ended up having to leave a fairly emotionally and toxic, like a very emotionally abusive relationship. So I got back on the Sunday, and then on the Tuesday, I emailed the party saying, hey, if you still need a candidate, I can do it. And then they're like, oh, we're good right now, but fill out the forms in case somebody has to drop out. So then a couple weeks, the week everything has to be finalized, they were like, somebody had to drop out in this riding, can you do it? And that's pretty much it. And during the campaign, I spent $300 on the entire campaign. I had leaflets. I didn't have signs with my name on it because we couldn't afford it. Yeah, again, so it was one hell of a wave is what happened. So yeah, that's kind of my story. And then since then, we've done a lot for queer people, and I can get into that later after everybody else does stuff.
I do hate you.
Thank you.
I've had to raise $1 million to stay in office, and you're $300 Canadian. So I'm totally throwing shade. Out of love. My name is Mary González. I represent El Paso, Texas on the border. Woo! Go Texas! I will say this, I'm not traveling a lot. As most of you have probably seen in the national news, in my district, we are there every day now. There are 4,000 immigrant kids living in tents in the winter in my district. So I usually stay home to make sure that we are fighting that fight. But I'm here today because this is home for me. The Victory Fund is a place in which I was able to be the most authentic version of myself. So I will say this, if you would have, okay, we can clap at that, yes. If you would have told me 6 years ago that I would be here, I would have never believed you. I got elected in 2012. I was 28, so still hate you. And I was running for office in a district that a woman, an LGBT person, a young person, a working class person had never been elected. But here I decided, because I was a professor, to jump in to practice what I preach to my students. Because I told them that if you want to change the world, then you need to make sacrifices, you need to be at the forefront, you need to be brave. And so I wanted to model that, actually thinking I was never going to win. So long story short, jumped in, we won, and I've been in the legislature for 6 years as a queer, Latina, Chicana, mestiza, temporarily able-bodied, working-class woman in the legislature. And so it was a big deal when I first got in, the first LGBT woman in Texas to get elected, and there were all these whispers. But here's what I will say. There's one moment that people always ask me, what are you the most proud of? And my freshman session, a few months in, one of the more conservative Republican members in the House, he sat behind me on the floor. And he came up to me and he put his hand on my shoulder, and I look up and he said, "Mary Edna, do you know you're the same age as my daughter?" And I said, "No, sir, I had no idea." And he said, "Well, on this House floor, you're my daughter." And so what that meant, though, is the ways in which when we humanize people, when we humanize policy, we can create social change. And so now in Texas, when I first came in, there were all these anti-LGBT bills. And while there's still anti-LGBT bills, I went to one of my colleagues who was notorious for filing these bills. And I asked him, and I said, "Why don't you file anti-LGBT bills anymore?" He's like, "Because you're my best friend here." So I just want to say that I was able to be myself because everybody in this room created the infrastructure so that people like me could be out, could be proud, and could be authentic. So thank you all.
Hey y'all, I am so excited to be able to chat with you without a voice. So I'm gonna keep it nice and raspy for anyone masculine of center in here, okay? And so greetings from Atlanta, Georgia. You might know of Atlanta as Hotlanta, and it's home for me. We have a rainbow crosswalk. If you've watched the TV show Queer Eye, that Karamo was here and was on, that's all filmed in the district I'm elected to serve in. And I'm blessed to be known around the country and the world as the first openly queer identified elected official. But as we talk about these different titles, I think it's really important that we talk about how it even happened. So in 2012, I was depressed. I left college because of a hate crime that happened to me. I was in my dorm room in California, very liberal area, and someone knocked on my door. I looked at the peephole and I didn't know the person, so I didn't answer the door. So they kept knocking. And they kept knocking. They started kicking my door. They started banging my door. They ripped the things off my door. And when I finally saw that they left and opened my door, the N-word was written all over it. And I filed complaints with my school. And what we'll say is their lack of action sent me into depression. I left college. I slept in a closet in my mom's little condo in Atlanta for about a week. I came down with what is known as Bell's palsy. It's generally a stress-related virus that causes paralysis in your face or on your body. So I was literally paralyzed from a race-based incident that as a young person in California, I would have never expected would have happened. So I started to get back on my feet. I started to find a job. I worked at a mall. I worked at Sunglass Hut and started to be a part of a retail culture that in that culture was very much sexualized. They wanted me to wear certain things, do certain things to make their product more appealing to the people they wanted it to sell for. And our market was actually men. But I was queer, but I wasn't out. And so I was continuing to have to be sexualized to a group to sell a product that really was not benefiting the people who I cared about. And so as I started to get back on my feet, working at that job, I realized that that parent company that I was working for, Luxottica, anyone who might have Ray-Bans on right now, or any other glasses, they own 80% of the eyewear industry currently. They didn't treat their workers well. They're not allowing for them to organize. So I started talking to my legislators about, what do you know about this company? They have a big plant here in Atlanta, Georgia. What are we doing about it? So much so, fast forward, that my legislator, Simone Bell, first Black lesbian to serve the United States Houses, she called me and she said, I'm resigning my seat and I want you to run, Park. I'll endorse you, but I'm exhausted. I can't help you. I've been doing this for so long. We've been fighting. Will you do it? At that point, I was about 6 months out of college. I was 23. I looked up the rules, and it said at 21 you can run. So I ran. We raised $50,000 through grassroots donations, millennials knocking doors, and here I stand, happy to be with you today.
Hi, my name is Daniel Hernandez, and I'm honored to be the state representative from District Number 2, and I'm also a school board member in the Sunnyside Unified School District. Arizona has a weird quirk in the law where you can serve in 2 elected positions at once, as long as one is unpaid. I've been a school board member since I was 21. I got elected while I was still a junior at the University of Arizona, and it was really, I think, an interesting opportunity for me to get involved. I will read you my Twitter bio really quickly. So I am a gay Latino feminist gun violence survivor who is a good kugel maker, drag, and karaoke aficionado. And I am the brother of another state legislator and the brother of another school board member. So my 2 sisters and I are all gonna be in elected office starting in January. Right. And he said it's a dynasty. I think for me, when I ran for office, I never had an intention of running. I was serving in the office of Congresswoman Gabby Giffords in 2011 when the shooting happened. I was an intern and I provided first aid. And I rose to prominence, obviously, because of what happened. Thank you. And prior to that, I'd been lobbying at the state legislature for affordable and accessible higher education for all Arizonans. So in high school, I did not have a great time. My school district had a lot of problems. We had an awful superintendent. I had a principal who told me when I was sick that it was less paperwork for him for me to drop out than it would be for me to get on an IEP, an individualized education plan. And I didn't drop out. I failed out of my junior high school year because I was unwilling to accept that the school couldn't do more for me. But I had great teachers and great parents who supported me. I came back my senior year, did my junior and senior year concurrently, trained as a nursing assistant, which is one of the reasons why I was able to provide first aid to the Congresswoman. But when I got to the University of Arizona, after my entire life saying I want to be a doctor because from the age of 5 I'd wanted to help people, I learned the importance of public policy and on the importance of advocacy. And Gabby was one of the people who pushed me to really open my mind up to the idea of being an advocate for others who couldn't speak for themselves. Growing up in a very loud Mexican-American family, the idea of not being able to talk for yourself was not one that I was familiar with. You had to be the loudest to be heard in my family, especially now with 3 elected officials. But it was something where I became aware of this. I started lobbying at the age of 18. I passed my first law at 20, a student voting rights bill, and it was something that was really eye-opening. So when I was 21 and the shooting happened and there was a vacancy on the school district that I had graduated from 3 years before, people in my community approached me and said, you should run. But like so many of us who are in this room, I was told now is not your turn. Now is not the right time. Do you really think a gay Latino can get elected? And I said, you know what? I'm gonna wait and see who the other candidates are. Because if there is a better candidate, I am happy to get out of the way to make sure that we have the best person, to make sure that the students have what they need, the staff is being treated well. And I waited until the day before the filing deadline. There was one woman who was running, and she was running to fire a principal because she didn't like them. So I said, if this is the best we've got, then I'm jumping in. So the day before the filing deadline, you needed 135 signatures. I took my parents and we went to 2 different grocery stores, stood out in front, collected like 150 signatures, got on the ballot, and then I raised about $10,000, which for a school board level at that race was unheard of. Won 65% of the vote in my first election, and then started dealing with a lot of nepotism and corruption that had been so endemic of that district, and was actually the person who was almost recalled because I asked too many questions. They used homophobic attacks against me. And if you actually go to Huffington Post and look up Daniel Hernandez, you can still see the posters that they were handing out about me. But because I had built relationships and worked hard to represent my constituents, when the vote to try and recall me was about to happen, nobody was willing to sign. They needed 1,300 signatures, they got about 80. I then looked at the numbers and I said, 1,300 signatures is nothing, I can do that in my sleep. So I, along with another group of community members, recalled 2 of my fellow board members. So at 24, I became the youngest school board president in the state of Arizona. I was in charge of an $83 million budget, 2,000 staff, and I said, I'll do this for 6 months, but I have a big agenda. Because I was in the majority, I had a 4-1 majority. I pushed through comprehensive sex ed. I opened a new K-8 fine arts magnet school, did a strategic plan, and then I was asked by my state senator in 2014, you're doing a great job in the school district, would you consider being appointed to my seat? I'm retiring. And I said, love to, I am too young. In Arizona, you have to be 25. So I was 6 months too young to be appointed to her seat. So I said, you know what, let's find another great candidate. My thing has always been, anytime I've run for office, I don't automatically assume I'm the best candidate. I always want to find the best person, because I think we are all better served when we have the right person in office. So I said, let's find somebody else. Well, the second person couldn't do it, the third person couldn't do it. Eventually somebody else, another gay man, got appointed. He proceeded to lose one of the safest Democratic districts in the state in the general election in 2014. So then after that I said, okay, now I have to start looking for another candidate. Spent a year looking for a candidate, and then after a year of trying to find somebody else who I thought could now beat an incumbent Republican, I said, there's nobody else, because everybody I asked who would be able to do it didn't want to do it, because it's the Arizona State Legislature. And I decided to run. I filed on February 29th. It was a leap year day, that's why I remember it, in 2016. I was running, and I had a very weird group of supporters, because I was working at Planned Parenthood at the time. I had all my experience as a school board member, but because my focus was on trying to bring people together to find solutions, I brought the extremes in terms of endorsements. I raised $123,000 in 8 months, unseated the Republican incumbent, and I beat the Democratic incumbent as well. It's a top 2 race in Arizona. So to go from nobody thought I should be running, having a member of Congress actively work against me because they didn't like me, and still be the top vote getter, I think was a really exciting thing. So I'm excited to be here. I'm a Victory Fund alumnus. I did the training back in 2011 with Brian Sims and Sean Malloy, who's now the political director. So I'm really excited to be a part of the Victory Fund family.
Good afternoon, Victory Fun. My name is Carlos Guillermo Smith, and I am a proud, progressive, feminist, queer, millennial Democrat serving in the Florida House of Representatives. I like saying that, although I don't feel like that's super unique on this panel, which is a rock star panel of millennials who are all very diverse, who all have a very, very strong message. And I think that's kind of the narrative of like where we are in 2018 in politics. I represent Orlando in the Florida House of Representatives, the University of Central Florida area. I was elected in 2016. Florida had a really, really rough year. Of course, we had some rough losses electorally in Florida in 2016. But also, I was elected within 6 months of the horrific tragedy at Pulse that claimed the lives of 49 mostly LGBTQ people of color. Pulse actually happened while I was on the campaign trail. One of the other roles that I have at the time and still now was that I was also a full-time staff member for Equality Florida, our state's largest LGBTQ civil rights group, when Pulse happened. So after the tragedy, it was very, very important that we had very clear, authentic voices advocating not only for queer Latinx individuals from Orlando who were impacted, but who could also help lift up the voices of other marginalized communities that were impacted by Pulse. For example, the queer, Black, and African American community, and many others who just simply didn't have a voice in the process. They didn't have a voice in the community, and it was important to have other people step up to help lift their voices up. The reason I ran for office actually was almost the direct result of homophobia and transphobia. I was a legislative aide and staffer for 2 former members of the Florida House, so I already had some sort of experience in the Florida legislature, but then I became the advocate for Equality Florida in our state capital in Tallahassee, fighting for LGBTQ people. And in 2015, someone from Miami-Dade, a Republican, filed a bathroom bill. At the end of the day, the bathroom bill was defeated. However, I was left feeling very unsatisfied with even some of our supporters, with how they fought against it, how they were mostly quiet no's against the bill. And I felt like I could see myself in this role of being a state lawmaker, and I felt like I could do it better, more authentically, and more effectively than most of the people who were there. So I say that because what I always tell people if they're frustrated by the fact that they don't have representation or that their voices are shut out, I tell them through my experience, the best way to get a seat at the table is not to ask for a seat at the table or even to demand it. You just have to walk in and sit down in the seat yourself. Just take it. And in my experience, what I've also learned after being elected was that even within our Democratic caucus, that it was important for us as millennials, as progressives, to create our own lane and navigate in that space. A couple years ago, after I was elected, I created the first legislative progressive caucus in the Florida legislature that was modeled after the CPC, the Congressional Progressive Caucus. We left last year with 20 members, four senators and 16 members of the House that were part of the Progressive Caucus. And the entire goal of the Progressive Caucus was to be able to advocate for the things that we cared about and start organizing as a block. I talk about equality and fairness all the time, but a lot of people, maybe at first glance, might have first assumed that equality meant LGBTQ equality. Equality means that, but it also means equality for immigrants. It also means equality for women. It means equality for ex-felons and disenfranchised voters who now, thanks to voters approving Amendment 4 in Florida, have their voting rights automatically restored. Fairness is not only not being discriminated against. Fairness means not having to pay 63% of your income on housing, or to be one of the 40% of LGBTQ homeless youth. They represent 40% of homeless youth overall. Fairness is not moving to Florida after a horrific hurricane in Puerto Rico and having to live in a hotel or a motel for a year because there's no affordable housing in our state. We are trying to define what fairness and equality means on our terms in ways that go well and far beyond just LGBTQ equality. And I'm really looking forward to a lot of new millennial members who just got elected to the Florida legislature, even though I know that the headlines you got from Florida this last cycle were not great. I apologize. Most people saw the disappointing statewide results, but the reality is that we flipped 5 Florida House seats from Republican to Democrat. That was the net gain in the Florida House. One of them was the first out lesbian in Florida from St. Petersburg, Representative Jennifer Webb, who's here today. We gained another state Senate seat, and we flipped 2 congressional seats. So progress in Florida is slow, albeit painfully slow, I know, but we're moving in the right direction, and I just couldn't be more proud to be serving in the Florida House and bringing that authentic voice.
Is anyone else feeling really inadequate right now? Because I see a couple hands. Okay. I have to say, I cover Congress, and this is like very different than what's going on in Congress.
More fun?
More fun. Let's say you're everything that is the opposite of what is usually in Congress. It's very refreshing to see young queer people of color actually getting in leadership posts. We're starting to see it in the House, as you all know, but it's a small percentage right now. So I'm impressed. Good job, guys.
We're taking over.
So I'm curious, why do you guys think it's important to make issues like gun control or immigration or treatment of prisoners part of a broader LGBTQ equality agenda versus just kind of, staying with the status quo, which is treating them like just general policy issues? Why do you think that it's important to do that?
I know from my experience, the reality is that when you bring credibility to an issue, then it makes you an even stronger advocate. Take criminal justice reform, for example. I know that finally we're in some parts of the country seeing some bipartisan consensus around criminal justice reform, but let's be honest, we have to make sure that lawmakers and elected leaders understand that a key component of criminal justice reform is making sure that we modernize HIV-specific laws that criminalize HIV status. That is an important intersection with our community, and we can't have real criminal justice reform without that. Our experiences and our voices in that matter. We need to make sure that they understand that criminal justice reform doesn't happen without cannabis reform. I've done 2 statewide cannabis decriminalization laws in the last 2 years, and I directly tied some of my stories and experiences to LGBTQ people who absolutely needed to access cannabis even as a medication so that they could actually get rid of the nausea that they have from the medications that they're on for HIV, that they needed cannabis to help with their PTSD. Some of them were pulse survivors, and that was a major intersection with our issue. Gun violence prevention. I saw in Florida how important it was for LGBTQ survivors and others from Pulse to join forces with the students from Parkland so that their voices could be amplified and magnified together, because bringing those communities together to end gun violence was important. And of course, when we're talking about gun violence, hate crimes come up. We're starting to see now legislatures are filing legislation that would basically say that if you were convicted of a hate crime, that you would not be able to possess or purchase a firearm. That is super important, not only after Pulse, but also after the shooting in Pittsburgh and the synagogue there, but also we need to remember that a conversation about curbing hate crimes against transgender women of color is a conversation that can't happen unless we're talking about gun violence prevention as well.
And thank you. I think he brings up a lot of interesting and important points. Anything that happens to human beings happens to the LGBTQ community. So by our nature, we are intersectional. When it comes to things like gun violence, 28 women of color who were transgender were murdered last year. More than half of them were murdered with guns. When it comes to immigration, we just saw what happened with Ms. Hernandez, who was in ICE detention, did not receive treatment for her HIV, did not even receive apparently water because she died from dehydration and because of complications from HIV. So when we talk about immigration policy, it's not an abstract policy concept. It is something that is happening and impacting our communities. So all of these issues are important. They do not exist in a silo. I think a lot of times, especially when I talk to older lawmakers, they say things like, well, why are you making this a gay thing? And I'm like, I'm not making it a gay thing. It became a gay thing when people didn't have access to healthcare because they were trans or because they were living with a pre-existing condition like HIV. So for us, as millennials, I think we are able to approach this from more than just one perspective. As a queer person of color, as a Latino, I'm able to see things from 4 or 5 different lenses. I check a lot of boxes, as I like to joke, but that means that I'm able to bring different perspectives, and I also acknowledge, and I think this is an important thing, that we are not Carlos and I are not fully respective of the LGBTQ community. Neither are the other folks here on the panel. So when we are doing things, we are bringing other voices, even though we know that they may not be our own. And I think that's where we as young people who are LGBTQ are so important, because we're able to open up the minds of our fellow lawmakers and say, here's where you're seeing it, but here are the other perspectives that you need to acknowledge that we are not even talking about.
I'm going to say something a little controversial. What's
Shocking.
New? What's new, Mary González? I think as we look at the history of the LGBT movement and community, at times it hasn't always been inclusive. And when we can look at all of our communities, I could look at the Chicano community and say like, oh, they didn't allow Chicanas or LGBT members in. And sometimes, no hate, total love, sometimes our community wasn't the most welcoming to low-income folks, to women, to trans folks, to people of color, to people with disabilities, to people with different body sizes, right? And so as we want to be a more inclusive and socially just community, as we fight for social justice, and we have to model it. And so in order to model it, we have to really be inclusive of the issues that are impacting people of color, for example, in the immigrant community. We can't look, and I'll be honest, I'm in a place where I'm feeling very, very connected to the struggles of immigrant communities because I live on the border right now and I see what's happening regarding border militarization, regarding the caravan, regarding 4,000 kids in tents in the middle of a winter. So I am just feeling it. And if we are in this room not simultaneously talking about the issues of the LGBTQ community and how LGBT folks are in that migrant caravan running away from violence in Latin America, then we are doing a disservice to our own movement. This isn't about us or them, it's all of us, and our movement is only stronger if we are inclusive to everybody.
So on a similar vein, obviously we have different issues in Canada than you do here, but like has been said, every issue is an LGBTQ issue. Making sure that our curriculums are up to date. Like in Alberta, we had a conservative government for 44 years before we came to power, and the curriculum hadn't been updated for 30 years. And they were still teaching that Soviet Union still existed, and that was a big problem, I think. So, and what else? Something else we did, we raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour because that's an LGBTQ issue. We froze tuition fees for 5 years and then indexed it to inflation so that people can afford to get a good education no matter what income they have. What else did we do? We did a bunch of stuff. In schools, we mandated that if a student wants a gay-straight alliance, that school has to provide a space and a teacher so that that kid can have his gay-straight alliance. We also made it illegal for schools to tell parents if a kid decides to go into a gay-straight alliances because we don't want our schools outing our kids. And because that's something that the opposition wanted to do. And I'm very partisan, by the way. And yeah. Like I said, every issue is an LGBTQ issue, and we need to keep pushing to make sure that our voices are heard whenever that comes up.
So these are all very creative and progressive ideas that are exciting. But then my question is, how do you then turn around and get your even Democratic colleagues and certainly Republican colleagues who are older and perhaps less connected to these things to care about this and to be helpful in actually changing policy?
Well, it's definitely been an interesting journey. When I got elected at 24, there was someone serving who was 94 in our assembly, and everyone was respectful of him because he was a World War II relic. I mean, we were, right? So we were all excited that he was still able to serve. And on both sides of the spectrum, you know, we had ageist remarks that would happen. But what we were seeing was he wasn't active. He wasn't really able to hear. He wasn't really able to move around on the floor. He was just voting party line. And so as I came in very voracious and ready to speak up about the issues that we were facing, I had to unpack the idea of a millennial being this novel set of people There have always been millennials. There have always been people who were 18 to 40 years old. And what have we inherited from those generations? When you see the headlines that say millennials don't vote, we must immediately unpack that. That is not true that millennials don't vote. What is true is millennials currently are the largest voting bloc that we have ever seen, and we don't have the numbers yet proving how we vote. We saw this electoral cycle, early voting numbers in District 58 specifically, up 360%. What number can that be, though, if 0 people were voting? That's not really a great number. But looking at the numbers, we saw that millennial turnout was surpassing 65 and up turnout, which is generally the numbers that we're looking at to say who votes. So as we continue to unpack these issues that millennials are bringing forward, we've also had to say to our colleagues, you have been a millennial, and what were you doing around voting rights when you were 18? If we think about in 1960s, when people were accessing the right to vote for the first time, we were so intimately engaged with voting because we saw our own family members perish for the right to vote. As we got through the 70s and the 80s, we started loving each other. We started embracing each other. Movements started joining together, and we got to spaces where we felt like things might be okay. We don't really have to vote so intensely. We don't have to really talk about it as much. As we got into the 90s and 2000s, voting as a curriculum for schools were being removed. So I say all this to say the ways that we have been able to move our policy efforts as millennials has been unpacking the idea of a millennial, and we need your help. So please, if you have not engaged with some of the millennial action organizations, there are numbers and scores of them that you can follow online that help us speak up about how millennials are all of us. Thank you.
So, I was trying to look up a quote by Bell Hooks, who's one of my favorite authors, and she talks about there's a struggle, and I'm just paraphrasing because I couldn't find it. There's a struggle between holding people accountable and having hope in their transformation. And for those of us who are elected, I think that's our struggle. So your question is probably the hardest thing I've had to deal with. I want my colleagues to transform to be more inclusive. But I also need to show them humanity, and that's not always easy when they do really oppressive shit, to create that space. So how do I, I'll give a great example. When SB 4 happened, an anti-immigrant bill, how do I in that moment not hate them because it was really just oppressive, in order to give them space to grow, to be anti-oppressive in that space and others? And that is a fine balance. And how do you hold them accountable? I mean, to me, we had an anti-LGBT bill at this last legislative session in Texas that said the state would allow for religious refusal, meaning that if you were a nonprofit helping the state in our foster care program, you could discriminate against people who were not the same religion as you, or were against your religion. So if they were LGBT, Muslim, or Jewish, you could discriminate. So I get up and I give the opposition speech. And my dad's a Republican. And I quoted my dad, who says, even though I'm a Republican, I love my daughter. And I'm giving hope that she's never going to have children because she doesn't date. The last avenue for me to have grandchildren is for her to adopt. And if you pass this law, then you're basically making it harder for my own daughter to ever give me grandchildren. It's beautiful. I wrote it for him. And so, he did approve it. But the point of the matter is that when that bill came to a vote, and as I gave this opposition speech, the hardest votes that voted against it were the Democrats who voted for that bill. Because I could take it from the Republicans in some ways, because maybe we're just used to it and maybe I'm desensitized, but there were 4 Democrats, and I just went up to them in tears. Right, in tears, like, how could you, right? So
Would you like to name them right now?
I've named them, but they're my
Just say it.
friends still. It's hard. I went to therapy. It's a struggle. I took one of them to therapy with me. But my point of the matter is that I think all of us in our moments of trying to create social justice are always trying to find that balance between holding people accountable and hoping for their transformation and recognizing their humanity. And I'll be honest, sometimes I don't get it right. But I think that in this is why we have these conversations, to try to figure out techniques to work through that balance.
I agree with everything she just said. Never disagree with Mary.
Never.
I am the youngest legislator. I am one of only 4 openly gay legislators, and I don't come into the legislature with a lot of power as a Democrat in the minority in Arizona. So for me, the challenge has always been, how do I build power to make sure that I'm representing my constituents? And not just my constituents in District 2, but anybody who is LGBT, anybody who is Latino. So for me, this was my 10th legislative session because I started lobbying when I was 18. So I came into the building and a lot of people said, well, you don't know how this place works. And I'm like, well, I passed my first bill when I was 20, but I'm not gonna tell you that, I'm going to show you that. So one of the lessons that I learned from an old legislator who is a dear friend of mine, who's a mentor, was when you get here, don't tell people what you know, show them. And shut up and listen sometimes. It was important because I serve with people who have told me that I'm going to hell because I'm gay. I serve with a member who is a self-proclaimed progressive. She yells at how we are not being progressive enough, and yet is one of the most homophobic people in the legislature, routinely saying, well, why did the LGBTQ caucus vote this way? And I'm like, since when did it matter that we were the LGBTQ caucus? Also, we're all gay Latinos. You can just say, why did the gays vote for this? And for me, it's been about building those relationships. So there was a big problem in Arizona with sexual assault. There was a drafting error in a bill 11 years ago that said that for domestic violence survivors, they could terminate a lease and leave an unsafe environment if they had police report or a protective order. But because somebody at the time had made a mistake when drafting that bill, sexual assault had not been included. And the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Coalition in Arizona had for 11 years tried to pass this fix. Seems like a minor fix, because literally all we were doing was adding "and sexual assault" to the existing legislation. And yet it kept running up into barriers, and when I found out about that, I'm like, that's so disappointing that we have something that could be so important to the lives of those who have been victimized, and yet because of partisan politics, it's not gotten anywhere. So what I did is I first tried to find the most conservative Republican, and I did, a woman named Maria Sims, who's on the Judiciary Committee with me, and I said, here's the issue. And what I did was I humanized the victims, and I said, here are their stories. Here are examples of people who are stuck in unsafe places. And I included stories of people who are in the LGBTQ community. And by humanizing things, she said, you know what, I didn't realize this was a problem. I want to work with you. And I became the prime sponsor of the bill, and she let me carry the bill, which is never something that happens in Arizona when you're in the minority. But we were able to work together, and we got this bill passed to protect sexual assault survivors. So for me, I'll wrap up really quickly. So for me, I think the lesson has always been we need to humanize ourselves and make sure that they see us as equals and as human beings. But then also when we're talking about policy and legislation, I'm gonna admit it, as a policymaker, we're not always the experts on every single policy. But what we do have are the stories of people we know and of people who come to us and share their experiences. And when we share that, we are more likely to get things done and be effective as lawmakers.
It's true, Daniel. And actually, I want to agree with everyone who's spoken so far about how millennials can really just change the minds of those who we are serving with. I mean, it's mostly about personal stories. Those of us who are advocates have learned that several times, that when you're lobbying an elected official, the best way that you can convince those in the movable middle is not with all the most persuasive facts and data. It's about telling your stories. But also, the question is about how millennials can use our power and our status to affect change and change the hearts and minds and change policy. How many of you serve in legislatures that you're the minority party, it's very difficult for you to get things done? How many of you out there? Only like 3 of you are in like minority legislatures? Okay, well, I come from Florida, and the way that we get things done, or the definition of success, can't be how many bills do you send to the governor's desk for a signature. As millennials, we have to harness our strengths. One of my strengths, and I know the strengths of many of you all who are millennials as well, is social media and using the power of social media to affect change. Earlier this year, there were reports that Publix, which is a grocery store in the South, which was also known with a homophobic record against some of its employees as well, was denying access to PrEP for their employees, saying that their employees could not have PrEP covered in their Publix health insurance policy. That was reported by thebody.com. The story got bigger and bigger from advocates who were speaking out against it. And I looked at the situation, I'm like, wait a minute, Publix has lobbyists here in the Florida Capitol. They're based in Florida. Had a couple of meetings with them. They wouldn't really give me the answers that I was looking for. And the answer that I was looking for, quite frankly, was, why are you doing this? Why is this your policy? I don't want to believe that Publix is not offering PrEP to their employees as part of their insurance coverage because you all are homophobic. I don't want to believe that. But tell me what the specific reason is and walk me through, because they did say that they had an exception for employees who could demonstrate that it was a urgent healthcare need, that it was a necessity. They could get a letter from their doctor that said that this was a situation that required them to have this medication. And I said, okay, well, please come back with those answers. I was not confident that they were going to reverse course, but no part of our meeting was private. So I tweeted out the synopsis of our meeting, and I said, look, y'all, I brought Publix in, tried to find out why this was their policy, and I also told them to get back to us with answers on how, let's say, a Publix employee who needed PrEP as part of their HIV prevention strategy because their significant other perhaps was living with HIV. Tell me, Publix, how that employee, which then would have to tell you that their partner is living with that HIV, how is that any of your damn business? And how are you asking your employees to reveal this to you without violating HIPAA privacy laws? I tweeted that out. Within 24 hours, Publix had reversed course, and they said they would stop denying PrEP coverage to their employees. But that didn't happen only because we shamed them and used social media as a bully pulpit. It was because we did that in combination with advocates on the ground who were speaking out. Everyone knew their lane. The advocates were telling their stories. People were speaking out on social media. And as an elected official, I went through my lane and I applied more public pressure. And overall, all of us together were able to make that change. I don't think that I think that is a millennial sensibility to kind of bully people on Twitter.
The Mean Girls approach?
Yeah, but you can, and actually that's part of a greater narrative as well, is when you're struggling as a member of the minority party, sometimes you can affect change by encouraging corporations and business leaders to do the right thing and implement change in that way versus legislatively.
That is a crazy story and an excellent point, and we are out of time. So thank you so much to our panelists.
Thank you.
For coming here and sharing these stories.
Thank you all. Thank you.